On behalf of the International Institute for Peace, I want to welcome you to our conversation today. I'm Heinz Gärtner. I chair the board of the International Institute for Peace, and we have regularly talks to important and interesting guests. Our topic today will be the NATO-Madrid Summit at the end of June. And our guest today can not be more qualified to talk about it. We have Ambassador Robert Hunter. He served as US Ambassador to NATO between 1993 and 1998. Also, he served on the National Security Council staff throughout the Carter administration, first as a director of West European Affairs and then as director of Middle East Affairs. And in this role, he was the White House representative at the autonomy talks for the West Bank and Gaza, and also contributor and developer of the Carter Doctrine for the Persian Gulf. Also, he worked for think tanks, and he was senior advisor to the RAND Corporation between 1998 to 2011, and director of the Center of Transatlantic Security Studies at the National Defense University between 2011 and 2012. And also he served on the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board and is a member of the American Academy of Diplomacy. And he is regularly guest on international TV and radio stations. Welcome, Robert. So there is no more qualified person to talk about this recent summit in Madrid, NATO Summit. However, there was another Madrid Summit in 1997, and in 1997 you still served as ambassador, US ambassador to NATO. So my first question would be, looking back from the 97 summit in Madrid to the summit in Madrid in 2022, what changed over time, over this 25 years, Robert?
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you again at the International Institute of Peace, and with you, Heinz, with your own leadership. And we understand here, those of us who are reasonably intelligent, that if we want to understand what's going on in the world, we ask you and ask your people. So it's an honor to be here. That's a very good question, because it was a quarter century ago. I was there at that summit. It was a hopeful time. And I assume because of what's happening now in Ukraine and with Russia in particular, that's what we want to focus on. Back then, we were still working on the aspirations that had been set by President George H.W. Bush in Mainz in 1989, before the wall came down, if people even remember what the wall was in Berlin. And he said we should try to create a Europe whole and free. And at peace was later added. Whole and free meant, in effect, to include all the countries of Europe that were coming out of the Cold War, and with the collapse of the old system, which in the East was dominated by the Soviet Union, which itself collapsed on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve in 1991. And there were a series of things that happened then. I should mention. The United States was going to remain in Europe. We have done that. We were going to retain the integrated military command system. We've done that. We were going to keep the German problem, which started in about 1866. You know more about this than I would. Not that you're old, but that you come out of that nearby background. To keep that problem solved, and it's still solved. We wanted to take Central Europe off the geopolitical chessboard, where it had been the proximate cause of 3 wars, 2 hot and 1 cold. We wanted to include Russia. There was an understanding, clear understanding in the West, and particularly in the United States, that we had to try to avoid what happened with Germany with Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, which made it take full responsibility for what was then called the Great War, and helped produce Hitler. All right. So the idea was not to stigmatize Russia, which was in '91 came out of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but to include it. And so we had a number of things. We had Partnership for Peace, where Austria is a member, incidentally, despite the State Treaty of 1955. You've been able to do that. Partnership for Peace and enlargement coming into NATO for a few countries. In fact, the first 3 countries were Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. The first were very important for European security because they surrounded Germany. It's hard to remember now that at the end of the 1980s and early 1990s, people still wondered what was going to happen with a unified Germany. In fact, Russia accepted that unified Germany would be fully within NATO, where frankly the United States could be there as kind of a handmaiden to watch over the German future. Well, we also had a NATO-Russia founding act of the 27th of May in 1997. One should look at it. It's got a whole series of principles and then 19 areas of specific cooperation, all of which make sense even today. Well, then the idea was, what about Ukraine? Ukraine was too close to Russia to be included in NATO without causing problems for Russia that would be intolerable for any major power. People forget, for example, when Fidel Castro declared himself to be a communist, even before he reached out to Russia, that was too much for us. And so we ran the Bay of Pigs, which was an ill-fated operation, but we couldn't handle having a potentially hostile country, however small, on our frontier. So we understood that Ukraine couldn't be left in limbo. We were going to try to prevent a return to balance of power politics, to spheres of influence, but we brought Ukraine closer to the West through a thing called the NATO-Ukraine Charter, similar to the NATO-Russia Founding Act. That's where we started, 1997. Well, from then on, the people in the U.S. government who understood the geopolitics, some of which I've just described, left the government. And people came into government over 2 or 3 or 4 administrations who tended to look at it as Soviet Union and hence Russia lost the Cold War, so we can do what we want. So enlargement went beyond the first 3 countries. The Baltic states were special. They had been independent, so we never recognized their incorporation into the Soviet Union. We never did. And that they were victims of the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. In fact, the Russians tolerated the first 3 countries, particularly Poland and the Czech Republic, coming into NATO, again, to surround Germany. They even tolerated, and today even Mr. Putin seems to tolerate the 3 Baltic republics in NATO, but Ukraine has been much too far. Among other things, it is on the high road, the classic high road, for invasions involving Russia and Western Europe, going all the way back, you might say Charles XII, but certainly Napoleon, certainly Hitler, certainly what happened with Soviet domination of Central Europe. So Ukraine had to be special. Well, there were a number of things that both sides did. I should say that there is one theory that Mr. Putin and Russia always wanted to reincorporate Ukraine in Greater Russia, even rebuilding the old Soviet Empire. And there's enough evidence for that. But I personally don't believe that that had to happen, that there were a number of mistakes particularly on our part. If I could keep it limited just to Europe, other than the U.S. abrogation of the ABM Treaty, dear to the heart of people in Vienna, the abrogation of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Treaty. The Russians got out of the CFE Treaty, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, another creation in Vienna. You guys don't seem to be having as much good luck as you need, but you did great work. But what we did, the worst thing was in the year 2008, George H.W. Bush got the Allies to agree, and it's very precise language, that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, will become members of NATO. That was the actual moment of commitment. It was at the Bucharest Summit. I was there. I was across the street at the Atlantic Treaty Association. We had a parallel summit. I was then president. I saw that instantly. I said, don't they know what they've just said? They've just made a commitment to Georgia and Ukraine. That's insane. Well, two other people saw it the way I did. One was Mikhail Saakashvili of Georgia, who used that pledge to try to get back South Ossetia. And he was pleaded with by the U.S. government, don't do it, but he did it anyway. And in 5 days, the Russians came in and slapped down the Georgians. It's a common view right now is this was Russian aggression against Georgia. Well, Georgia started it. But the main point, not a single NATO ally came to Georgia's defense. It demonstrated that nobody was going to be prepared to give NATO's Article 5. If there's aggression from abroad, everybody considers themselves to be at war with the aggressor. What they do about it is their own choice, but they're going to be at war. And at the time I said, having demonstrated that the Bucharest pledge was nugatory with regard to Georgia, I hope we don't do something stupid with regard to Ukraine. Well, we ended up doing stupid things with regard to Ukraine as time went on. Instead of dropping that pledge, they repeated it every NATO meeting ever since. And in fact, if you look at the documents that were produced to this Madrid, long documents, I'll give you a little hint about NATO, maybe it's two other international institutions. The longer the document, the less content. The NATO treaty is very short. It didn't have to be very long. But the so-called strategic concept, which I said they shouldn't even try to do. Well, there's a war going on. You don't know what NATO's going to look like even tomorrow, much less soon. But they slipped that in again by reference. It said, we continue to honor all the agreements we took in 2008. That was stupid. And also there's the issue, and I'm sorry to stop boring all your audience with this technicalities, but these things matter. Article 10 of the NATO treaty says if there are other countries that can meet the things that we have in the West, yeah, we'll consider taking them in too. And that became what was called the NATO open door policy, that new countries could come in. Well, at the NATO Madrid summit this time, they repeated that. Forgetting, of course, that to join NATO requires unanimity. NATO never takes a vote, never. Any ally can say no, and that's the end of it. 9, that's the end of it. And it's been clear that Ukraine could never join NATO. because there's always some countries will say, we're not going to risk it. The Germans and the French have said it for years. So in some way, the issue is moot, but it still was poking the Russians in the eye with a sharp stick. Now, as to Mr. Putin's motives, I'm not going to get into it. We now have a war, and I'll be bottom line. I don't think the Madrid summit did what it had to do, which is to show more pushback against Russia. I think the NATO summit then therefore failed.
Let me ask about this Bucharest summit. You mentioned important things here. And of course, as you said, the new strategic document again reaffirmed the conclusions of the Bucharest summit. And this was basically, as you said, the option for the membership. NATO called it the open door policy. The option for the membership for Georgia and Ukraine. Now you have it in this new strategic concept again. Does it mean that the option for non-membership, or some would call it neutrality for Ukraine, for NATO is off the table? Because already in March there have been negotiations in Istanbul, and they almost agreed about this neutrality on Ukraine. But it was off the table the next day. So now I read in the strategic document that the Bucharest summit is still alive. So does it mean that NATO still thinks Ukraine should become a member? There is no membership action plan, of course. It was avoided by Germany and France in 2008 as well. But it is a kind of commitment of NATO now to, even so it might take many, many years, if at all. However, it's a commitment by NATO to include Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. Would you read it the same way as I do, or would you think that's not that strong?
Well, let me repeat. Ukraine and Georgia are never going to join NATO, because there's always going to be some allies who are going to say, we don't want to commit to go to war for these countries. Georgia, way off in the corner here, who's going to send troops to defend Georgia if its country's being attacked? It's not going to happen. I'm sorry for Georgia, I know it quite well. And with regard to Ukraine, you've already mentioned the French and the Germans, and there'll be a lot of others. So the idea of including that in the strategic concept was, I guess, to avoid the political embarrassment of not saying it and calling attention to it. It's buried down in the document. You have to read the whole document to see it. Now, having been at NATO, I can tell you, nobody reads strategic concepts at NATO. They're devising them as really a way of thinking through the issues. You write them down. The military read them because they read everything. But diplomats at NATO don't even bother with it because you've got day-to-day things to do. But unfortunately, that was left in there. But the real thing was, in my judgment, at the last summit, was that in order to show that everything else that NATO was doing was real, that we had to show that we were going to take a more active role in helping Ukraine defend its own territory. And frankly, the person who most created this opportunity, if you can call it that way, but I say more an obligation, was Volodymyr Zelensky, who rallied his country. A lot of people, quite frankly, looking at it in raw realpolitik terms, said, okay, Putin's got this ambition, the war started, get the war over with as fast as possible, and then we can get back to business as usual. But got shamed by what the Ukrainians themselves did. Now, it is true that there has been the provision of a lot of weapons from the West, and I'm one of the few people to argue this, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, I think I'm right, just enough weapons in order to help the Ukrainians who've done the fighting all by themselves to save Kyiv and to save that part of Ukraine and to drive the Russian ambitions down to the Donbass and on the Black Sea, but not give them so many weapons that they might be able to push the Russians out of Ukraine. Now, the Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland said at the time of the summit, "Oh, we have to help them expel the Russians." Well, Britain's not going to do it. Nobody's going to do it. I mean, that's absolute hypocrisy. So what we have now is a war of attrition. I call it the Second Battle of the Somme from 1916, which is all the fighting is taking place in Ukraine, all the destruction in Ukraine, not in Russia, except for one big ship that got sunk. And all those civilians who are getting killed are Ukrainians, not Russians. They're Russian soldiers being killed, but not civilians. Because the first thing that President Joe Biden said is, we're not going to get involved directly. We're not going to get NATO involved directly. We're not going to send troops, etc., which gave Putin kind of free play, except for what the Ukrainians did. So my judgment, if all this other apparatus, which was put together at Madrid, the 100,000 American troops, which have been there more or less since the beginning of the year, augmenting the NATO Rapid Response Force from 30,000 or 40,000 rather, to 300,000. Doesn't mean they're there. It means they're on call. And a U.S. military base now in Poland for the first time. None of that really matters in my judgment. In what Napoleon said, the ratio between the morals and the physical is 3-to-1. If Putin does not find a need to negotiate, in effect, what could have been done before February 24th, people are now saying, how do we get, they say it quietly, which is what they say to Zelensky, you got to negotiate. Well, what's going to require Mr. Putin to negotiate? In my judgment, only if Ukraine has a much greater capacity, even if it's just within Ukraine, to make Mr. Putin suffer and his military suffer. I hate to say it, to have a war to get to peace, but right now, if Zelensky decided to negotiate, and if Putin were willing to negotiate, it's not at all clear that, probably not at this point, then there will still be out there, even though Ukraine is not a NATO member. It was almost a NATO member when you say will become a member of NATO. That's a political commitment, a moral commitment, strategic commitment, not a legal commitment. Then I think the future of NATO is in serious jeopardy.
It was probably a wise decision not to get NATO troops directly involved in this war. And it's interesting that you said you give Ukraine enough weapons to defend itself, but not to drive out the Russians altogether. So the new strategic concept confirms its commitment of NATO to nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence as well. So what you think? Of course, Putin once in a while said he still is a nuclear power, and some see it as that he threatens NATO and other countries not to get involved. But if that happened, that Russian troops would driven out from Ukraine altogether, so might that be a possibility then Putin might think to use smaller nuclear weapons by himself, because Putin is not the one who really accepts a total defeat. And if that, what would be the NATO reaction?
Well, first, nobody knows what Putin's thinking or what he'll be thinking down the road. He probably has more authority than anybody does in the West to determine Russian policy as opposed to even United States policy, where the president has other constituencies he has to look at. Nuclear weapons are always in the background. Now, you and I could say to use nuclear weapons over something going on in Ukraine would be absolutely insane. Well, a lot of things in history have happened because of insanity. So that's why one reason the United States is being very cautious. And a major reason, with backing of NATO allies, are even more scared of this than we might be, that Russia will, quote, not be pushed so far to try to get them out of Ukraine entirely, that there might be a consideration by Mr. Putin of using nuclear weapons. People jumped all over the French president when he said we must not humiliate Russia. Well, in the mix, that's one of the elements, all right? But at the same time, Mr. Putin is conducting the most serious war of aggression in Europe since World War II. What happened down in Bosnia was significant, but one thing we knew, and I was very much involved in that, I had a terrible little line. I said, you could kill as many Austrian archdukes as you want in Sarajevo, and you're not going to have World War III. It was understood by everybody that the war in Bosnia was not going to escalate to something broader. Well, that's not true with regard to this. So that's a reason to calibrate this, but to get to the point where there can be a serious negotiation. Now, if I were to walk this back, and some of us, and I'm sure you were one of them, would have said, well, maybe you would, you can speak for yourself, that prior to February 24th, the so-called Minsk II agreement, which would have given serious autonomy for the areas that are now being contested militarily, would have dealt with the Russian-speaking, Russian ethnic people who make up the majority, at least until people started moving it did, in the so-called Donbass region. Everybody understands that Crimea is not going to come back to Ukraine. It shouldn't have been in Ukraine in the first place. That was a birthday present that Khrushchev, a Ukrainian, gave in 1953-54 on the 300th anniversary of Russo-Ukrainian relations. And frankly, nobody is going to contest Ukraine. But a solution would have to be Ukraine has to have access, uncontrolled access to the Black Sea. It needs to have security for all the rest of its country. Yes, it should likely, best idea, have sovereignty over all of Ukrainian territory, leave aside Crimea. And that could have been had, in theory, prior to February 24th, but neither side was prepared to work on that basis seriously. As late as January 26th, the U.S. Secretary of State said, we are absolutely committed to the open door. It is a sacred principle of NATO. That was at a time when maybe diplomacy might still work. That was an incredibly stupid thing to say. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that about one of my government officials. And that was just, it wasn't a serious effort there. So that's where we could have been and where we're going to have to get to.
Yeah, but now we have another, we were talking about NATO enlargement, and you're saying that Ukraine and Georgia are not going to become NATO members because of some resistance of NATO members by themselves. But we have another round of enlargement now. We have the northern enlargement. And of course, it's also a poke in the eye of Putin, because it is a defeat of Putin if the non-aligned countries, Sweden and Finland, are going to join NATO. So we have now this 1,300 kilometers long borders, direct borders between NATO and Russia. If Finland joins, that's about as long as the Ukrainian border with Russia would be. Isn't that also an act of escalation? Because we have this long border, and there are also, it is possible there are all kinds of incidents might happen. We know this from the Cold War. First of all, in the areas which were NATO and Warsaw Pact directly were touched, the borders touched between, in the German border, the Czechoslovakia German border, for example. So there is a direct contact line. And we had this Iron Curtain during the Cold War. So is it possible that now in this new direct border between NATO and Russia, we will have another Iron Curtain, and the possibility of all kinds of incidents might happen as well? Was this a wise decision? Of course, Russia is downplaying it because Russia doesn't want to admit this defeat. It's embarrassing for Russia. But in the strategic concept, and also Secretary General Stoltenberg said, we are going on the eastern flank. We will have combat formation pre-deployed. He spoke about pre-positioning that is easier than troops might follow. He talked about a present eastern flank of NATO. Some call it front already. But it might in the future also include especially Finland and also Sweden, probably in the Baltic Sea. Does it make NATO more safe, or is it more possible for all kinds of incidents after this northern enlargement?
Well, Sweden doesn't matter that much because the country itself doesn't have a border with Russia. It does have control, in effect, of access to the Baltic. If NATO ever wanted to do that, that would be theoretically part of NATO. But the real one is Finland. I did argue with my Finnish friends not to do this because one didn't see a threat from Russia to Finland. The nature of the relationship there, going way back, was such that there were mutual understandings about what could happen and what couldn't happen. The concept of Finlandization actually really worked during the Cold War. The Austrian State Treaty worked during the Cold War and afterwards. People forget what a major achievement that was. The Soviet forces left Austria after the State Treaty in exchange for permanent neutrality. Though an active military defense, I visited Austria in the 1980s and got a sense from the man who became commanding general of exactly how you were positioned. If Russia the Soviet Union did invade Austria, which is very intelligent. But as you say, it does create, to use miles, an extra 830-mile border with Russia. And Mr. Putin, incidentally, however he might have felt, just kind of brushed it aside. He said, okay, so Finland and Sweden, who cares? Meaning, in effect, I don't have any ambitions towards them. They didn't have the same historic, certainly Finland, not same historic, certainly Sweden rather, same historic relationship to the Russian Empire, even though it had been part of the Russian Empire at one point. But they had a set of understandings over time. But you're absolutely right, there could be incidents. There could be things happening elsewhere in which Mr. Putin would decide to test matters there. The Finnish and Swedish forces are really quite formidable not to pose a threat to Russia. None of this really poses a physical threat to Russia. It's kind of how great powers see themselves. And to say, oh, Russia, you're not allowed to feel that way. Well, the Chinese do, we do. We got World War I in part because countries felt this kind of thing. So you got to be careful when overstepping boundaries, particularly when it doesn't do any good for us. There is no benefit for the West of having Ukraine in NATO, none whatsoever, except an added burden to get to the realities of the situation. So I do worry about an extra 830 miles of potential vulnerability. And it could be used by Putin to feed his narrative, and I think he, over time, would use it. His narrative for a long time is NATO is trying to surround Russia. It doesn't really matter to them that Romania and Bulgaria came into NATO, or even Hungary. That's not the way anybody's going to invade Russia, and Russia would never invade the other way. With all the history there was, people forget there's a lot of history here. And certainly what's going down in the former Yugoslavia, those are kind of throwaway countries. But once you start moving to Georgia, then the narrative, and Putin does have some public opinion now, there was Russian nationalism. There's a sense of pride. And one of the worst things that we did after George H.W. Bush and after Bill Clinton is we stopped respecting Russia. Both of those two presidents I mentioned never said we won the Cold War. They said everybody won the Cold War. Now let's move on and see what we can build. And then later on, people said, oh, we won the Cold War, so what are they going to do? Well, as a lot of us knew, Bush knew, first Bush, Clinton, etc., Russia was going to rise like Phoenix out of the ashes. Great power, major power, great power, who knows? Superpower, never. It's never going to be a superpower. It is a small economy, happens to have nuclear weapons, has a capacity to cause mischief, and it's going to cause challenges to the West and the Middle East in particular, Syria, its relationship with Iran, its concerns about Central Asia and the like, where there was, I believe, too much pushing by the United States and also by Israel going into Central Asia. The conundrum of what about Turkey? So to go back to your central point, how much should NATO be supporting Ukraine now? I think enough so that it's clear that Russia cannot advance any further. And since the NATO-Summit, they have already managed to seize a couple of more cities and almost complete the investing of the Donbass. And who knows what they might be still trying to do to make Ukraine a landlocked power. They already have made them a landlocked power in terms of the export of grain. People forget how important Ukraine is to the global economy. It's the second largest exporter of wheat after the United States of America. The Ukrainian flag, blue at top and yellow at the bottom, and blue at the top of the sky, and the bottom, that's wheat. That's where the flag comes from. In fact, I'll introduce one other subject, which is sanctions. Sanctions don't work.
No.
Almost never. But we impose them to feel good. But the countries suffering in reality from sanctions are the Western countries, not Mr. Putin.
I have to come back to two more points of the strategic concept. Reading this, the new strategic concept now, collective defense, Article 5 tasks are dominating. So in the past, NATO had these three core tasks: crisis management, cooperation, and collective defense. Now, actually, the collective defense is overarching all of the other core tasks. So, and it is also applied to hybrid threats, to cyber. Of course, it was included cyber in Article 5 task already in the previous NATO documents. But of course, we all know that cyber attacks, they are hard to attribute, so it has a potential of escalation as well. But clearly in this context mentioned is China. China as with its malicious cyber and hybrid operation. So that's the formulation of the strategic concept. So potentially a cyber attack which is attributed to China could trigger Article 5 operations of NATO. That would be a global, if I wouldn't say necessarily world war, but it basically mirrors the global conflict between US and China. So it's, and actually the only one European Union is mentioned in the strategic concept. It says the European Union is compatible with NATO, especially when it comes to the challenge of China. So China is sneaking in this strategic concept, and even including collective defense and Article 5, as you probably know much better than anybody else, was limited to NATO territory in the past. So what do you make of this collective defense, cyber, hybrid China connection?
Well, first you may notice that in the strategic concept, they slot in a couple of these things like hybrid and like might rise to the level of Article 5. The other allies are concerned about it, but everybody's very reluctant to get to the point of including other things under Article 5, because then how do you define it? How do you define it? How do you know where you've got a situation where you're actually going to go to war for something? So that's number one. That's incidentally, you and I may be two of the very few people who actually read the whole document. This is not something that's I'm going to turn this off. These pesky machines, right? Okay. Now, with regard to China, very few of the European countries, and I'd be hard-pressed to name any that I'm confident of, want to see China included in problems for NATO and European security. It was slotted in there to a great extent because of the United States. It is not taken seriously by a lot of these countries. Bringing in the leaders of 4 of the East Asian countries as observers, I guess it doesn't cause a problem, but except however you calibrate relations with China, I think they probably couldn't care less because they know they're not going to be in serious competition except economic with regard to other Western countries besides, that is, European, North Atlantic countries. The British sent an aircraft carrier out to the Far East. Big deal, okay? But you raised something quite serious, because the definition of Article 5 is modified by Article 6, which says, where does this apply? In effect, it was in the North Atlantic region, north of the Tropic of Cancer, and it excluded all the colonies of the Allies in 1949, except for Algeria, because that was part of France. And when it became independent, there was a modification of the treaty to get rid of Algeria. And that was written by the United States in order to keep us from being dragged into something we didn't want to do. Well, nobody even thought about China at that point. And frankly, the idea that somehow something that China would do would lead to a invocation of Article 5 again, ambiguous because of the territorial issues. But let's say that the Chinese, for some reason, used cyber in a major way against the United States. Could we invoke Article 5? I can't see any European country sitting still for that. Takes it unanimity again. If it were an attack on Germany or France, then you have another matter. And it might not even done on Article 5. There might be other arrangements to push back against China. But this is one of the serious issues that's going to have to be debated in the future. And the United States, as we go through this particular crisis, has sort of put China on the back burner. But I think it is correct in terms of American geopolitics and what we call the international order is going to focus more on China than it is on Russia. We're focused on Russia now because it went into Ukraine. Otherwise, that would have been a secondary area. Iran is a tertiary area, and I think we made a big mistake there too, but that's another matter.
We slowly have to come to an end, even so it's fascinating. I just could continue to listen to you and your experience. The Secretary General Stoltenberg spoke about this summit as historic and transformative. But the summit did not mention really transformative issues. So it's the first time a NATO document doesn't mention the OSCE. Then also it is not mentioned the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Also, it's not mentioned the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. So there are lots of blind spots here in this document, that it's narrowly focused on the direct and significant threat of Russia and on China. So it's not really that global transformative as I would like to see it. So what is your general assessment of this strategic concept? That's about, so that's how it looks like.
I got a copy here too. Everybody, you can download it from the internet. It's only 16 pages.
So is it that transformative or is it narrow? So that's what I'm asking. And what should have been in and what is not in the concept in your final thoughts here?
Well, first, I wouldn't know how to sell it because that requires you to do and say things that you might regret or not say things. I think the big failure was not to take a position with regard to Ukraine that's going to send a clear message to Mr. Putin. There's a lot of talk, but not a lot of do. That's very hard to calibrate, but that's where you have to do it. You mentioned the European Union. It gets one paragraph. The cooperation with NATO, which I initiated back in 1993, really hasn't progressed that far. And yet NATO-EU cooperation needs to be really there. There is a passing reference to, well, if the Europeans want to have some kind of European force and maybe division of labor and all that, but that's just kind of brushed aside. That was a big error. What I'm really worried about transformational. One idea is how do you work out, and it's still evergreen. We're still back where we were in 1991 and certainly 1997. How do you accommodate Russia within European framework? Big geopolitical question, the biggest geopolitical question that there is, since there's been a huge success in Western Europe and now with Central Europe as well in terms of engagement in, quote, the West. We're going to have to face that in the future. And what I worry about, among other things, is we're headed in the direction of a new rigidification, a new true Cold War. Now, Cold Wars imply that there's not much you can talk about, that you have to build up all kinds of things, the logic of confrontation. And there was a lot of logic of confrontation that came up on that. You put an extra rapid reaction force, you put troops here, you put troops there, this kind of thing. But nobody is yet saying this is a new, quote, Iron Curtain or a new Cold War. Think of the cost of that. Think of what you're going to have to do in the future over Ukraine, over Russia, which is not the Soviet Union. It has the capacity, despite what they have now not been able to do militarily. Well, down the road, they will be. They will be if they make the investments. You might say in terms of Putin flexing his muscles, he tried it about 5 years too early. I'm just thinking logically now, and I'm not making recommendations. So transformative in a negative sense, potentially, but in a positive sense. For example, there's nothing on arms control. Oh, we're going to talk about it.
Right.
There's no framework for saying when we get past Ukraine, however we get past, we still have to find a way with Russia to develop structures, systems, processes, understandings, relationships, talking that is going to help us build something for the future. There was, unless I missed it, no reference to the NATO-Russia Founding Act, no reference to the NATO-Russia Council, which is in abeyance now, but which was a perfectly good way of dealing with things. It started out, as you know, with NATO sitting on one side of the table and Russia sitting on the other. And NATO would take a position and Russia would get kind of stuck with it. NATO-Russia Permanent Joint Council. Then they went to the NATO-Russia Council, in which everybody had a veto. Russia was treated as an equal. Well, respect matters in international politics. And there has to be respect by Putin of Ukraine's sovereignty, respect of not threatening other countries. There needs to be respect on our side that Russia is a serious place that we're going to have to deal with. And one might also say the more we have to do this that we're talking about, the less time and effort we're going to have to work on the relationship with China. You also mentioned the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The United States should simply have rejoined it a year ago, January. Why didn't we? Because of the Israel lobby. It's a domestic political issue here. In fact, right now, you have the President of the United States going to see Saudi Arabia to a great extent to try to get more oil out of them. But there is a great pool of oil sitting in Iran that if we were quite serious about helping Europeans with oil, we would rejoin the JCPOA. Could do it tomorrow. President Bush could do it tomorrow. Lift the sanctions related to it, then say to the Iranians, we've done our part. Now you have to go back with your nuclear program to where you were when Trump left the JCPOA. And if they don't, then you can do snapback. We won't even consider it. You can't even talk about that in public in the United States for fear of political retribution. It's like that.
That will be the next topic we will talk about with you and your wife Shireen. She's an expert on the JCPOA, and there's something coming up. I'm sure that will be an issue to the next coming.
She's one of the world's leading experts on it, so better ask her.
Yes.
As you know.
But when it comes to Europe, of course, we have to think how, in the long run, we have to incorporate Russia again. We have to think beyond Putin. And we have to think beyond the Ukraine war and not create an Iron Curtain right now, which might stay there for decades. So I was thinking in the long run, maybe we will have a new Congress of Vienna, and which lasted for half a century, actually for 1 century.
99 years.
Century. We had some wars, the Crimean War in between. So, but after that,
the Franco-German War, and that's what.
Franco-German, Italian.
But it didn't break everything apart.
Of course, there was unification, but nevertheless it worked. So I was thinking about this in the long run. Putin might be gone, but the Iron Curtain might stay, and that might be unfortunate for Europe, because Europe will have to deal with it. The US will focus on China, and we will have to think about the peaceful future of Europe as well.
Let me just say one thing. I'm not sure we have to wait until after Putin.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows? I mean, he may be a realist when it comes to that, in terms of saying, what's the future of Russia, even if I'm around for another 50 years? So to write off Putin, to say it's in his genes, this man's just a KGB agent, he's crazy, that kind of stuff. I mean, this is just idle living room chit-chat. We may have to deal with Putin on the basis of realities. Now, that'd be very tough in moral terms, but it's not something that's beyond the pale.
Thank you so much, Robert. We have exhausted the time right now, but we will come back to several other issues you mentioned. It was fascinating as always. Thank you so much for your time and for your insight. We will come back to you as soon as possible.